So we're getting to part 4. I've actually re-recorded some of these twice because the microphone was busted and there was no sound, but we're going to redo this one, part 4, because I think 1993 is pretty important to go over in terms of the formative, uh, I guess maybe just the environment to where we started to hear more melody infused into black metal, as things like dark metal and melodic death metal and death and roll and all these things became to spark up as very responsive trends within the European and even partially in the United States territory. We don't really begin our discussion in the United States for some time. A lot of the innovations in melodic metal in general were kind of limited to what was going on in Europe, especially Scandinavia at this time. And I guess you'll have to watch part 3 for a little bit more context on what else was going on besides these things that I'm discussing here in terms of 1993 and all that. Otherwise, we can kind of get right into the first piece here. Quite an important demo tape for Ancient, their Eerily Howling Winds tape, which was popular enough to get them signed to, I believe, Listenable Records back in 1993 or so. So this was a duo who had played in death metal band Putrefaction, and they've actually reissued. Soul Cellar Records has reissued their debut demo, Putrefaction, as a 7-inch, I think, and that was par for the course for Norwegian bands at the time who were still playing in death metal groups until black metal kind of broke out and became a thing. And so Ancient became a black metal band in 1992. They'd figured it out. I think they took about 6 to 8 months to write this tape, and they put together about 14 minutes of atmospheric and, I would say, heavy metal influenced black metal. This is, I think, directly comparable to what Agatas were doing if we remove the Hellenic black metal affect and give a little bit more of our Norwegian atmospheric sound. But I don't think this was such a typical tape for the Norwegian sound. This was decidedly atmospheric and melodic in its movement in some sense. They weren't quite there yet in terms of what their sound would become soon after. So we need another release or two to really get to the sort of meat of it. But Ancient is an important band to introduce here as part of the Norwegian melodic ideals introduced around this time. So check that out. So I've put off talking about Dark Tranquillity to this point because I think that they become most solely important to this discussion on Skydancer. This is a very underrated record, which really does make the case for the dual guitar harmonizations and disharmony and technical aptitudes of bands like Eucharist and Dissection here with Skydancer. This record is intensely good. It is intensely musical. It is full of all of the things that became part of the vernacular of melodic death metal soon after, in terms of acoustic guitar interludes, the classical guitar touch to it, a little bit of the gothic vocal treatments, and very dramatic romanticist lyrics. And the thing to note about this record is it is intensely detailed in its rhythmic movements. The interplay here is insane in a lot of respects, where it just seems to be ranting on forever. But taking a much lighter hand than a record like Red in the Sky Is Ours or With Fear I Kiss the Burning Darkness at the time, this is much more of an easy hand, and there's a prettiness to everything that they do on this record, which is a pretty dramatic step from the darker death metal they were playing before in Septic Broiler. This record has sort of been shoved under the rug for so long and never really given a lot of love, despite, well, I mean, because they were just kind of embarrassed that it was a little bit convoluted and they wanted to go for something more accessible. Well, that kind of sucks because it's a great record if you're a fan of the tension that two guitarists can work up in a style of death metal like this. This is a very unique record, and one that should be studied by more guitarists and composing these sort of challenging dual guitar rants, because there's just nothing else like it, and we need more records like this. You know, I hate that the band never celebrated this record heartily, because it is such a cool thing and it's something that people have always wanted more of. And the only place I've been able to find anything remotely similar is within Swedish melodic black death metal and bands that are influenced by it. And by chance, groups happen upon this sound a little bit, but it is fairly unique. So give it a chance. I think you'll see the correlation later on as we get through maybe deeper into like 1996. But this was I think it's a special record, and you should know it even if you don't like the gothic vocals or whatever. By stark contrast to what Dark Tranquillity were doing at the time, At the Gates were doing something which was much darker, much heavier and aggressive, and I think purposefully noisome and different from their first record. Many people felt like their first record was very standard death metal, and this was much more technical, complex, and challenging. With, I think, the songwriting of Alf Svensson and some of his most complex extended pieces are on this record, and they're never as celebrated as the stuff that came later on. But there were a lot of viably heavily melodic pieces that are just as good as anything on Terminal Spirit Disease on here. They just never really get to the point very quickly, and for me, this is an example of refusing that heavy metal urge and leaning into something which is a very complex melody written for two guitars that are sort of purposefully reversed and out of sync with each other. And the way that they harmonize is pretty intense here with the uglier production values. It's a very confrontational and draining record, and I think that if you give it serious time, it just you certainly wouldn't call it typical Swedish melodic death metal at all. And I think that a lot of black metal musicians in their sort of sphere appreciated that sort of ugly confrontational tendency of this sound to the point that it affected some of their attempts later on to more groove oriented forms of melodic death and melodic black metal. So for me, this is just an important part of the vernacular. It's an important piece of the language that a lot of people forget about that is still very important. So we see a band like Dawn now making the transition essentially to melodic black death metal, and especially incorporating black metal infused guitar movements and sounds, as well as vocals that have completely changed beyond their first two tapes. And now this 1993 promo tape shows the black metal side of the band fusing with the death metal side. And the drummer hasn't quite caught up and changed up his style, but the rest of the band more or less has here on this tape, and it makes for kind of a cool intermediate step, which is very obvious and easy to read as we go through Dawn's discography. We see this as the point where they kind of became the band they were known for on their debut. Their debut is one of my favorite records in black metal of all time, and this is important context to where that came from and how the transition did happen. Of course, anything that was recorded at Unisound or whatever they were calling the studio at the time, this is a fine example of the polished enough sound, and there are remastered versions of this tape that clarify some of that. But you do get the bones of some key songs that did end up on the full length. So we'll get there when we get there, but the full length is kind of where I'm headed with this. Again, one of the better bands in this style, and one of the bands I'm most excited to talk about. So check this one. Pay closer attention to this one. So I was always a little bit surprised that Christ Agony were considered a melodic black death metal band or a melodic black metal band. And I don't think it was because of this record. I think it was because of later records, because this one is still related to what like Barathron and Samael were doing. There was still a bit of Bathory in their sound. They weren't quite touching upon the more melodic black death metal influences that you'll find on their next record yet. So what we have here is essentially a black, semi-melodic black doom metal record, which is one of my favorites of the time. You know, if you can imagine, like I really love that first Barathron album, and this one is close by. I'm also a huge fan of like worship hymn and records like that, and so that feeds into my like having quite a strong taste for this record. It is one of those random finds that I discovered years ago, and it's has always been one of my favorite records from the early Polish black metal scenery, and as well as something related to the ancient black metal sound and the way that the slower paced stuff is usually really effective. So I could go on about this record, and I don't think it's entirely related to the discussion here, but their later records will be. So I wanted to like take the step in between and just remark that this is a pretty substantial record. It takes a lot of patience. These are very long songs, and there's only a few of them, so you're really in it once you're locked into it, and that immersion was really part of the way that I kind of fell for the record overall. So definitely a huge recommendation for me. If this is your type of thing, I think this is a record that more people should celebrate for just how effective it is, and check it out and decide for yourself. So Al Guyon's self-titled tape is just a couple of quick songs that they fired off in a very simple style, which is clearly influenced by the Hellenic black metal style of the time. It is a similar affect, it's a similar style, and it uses a drum machine in a primitive way. I don't know that they were directly going for, sounding like Rotting Christ or whatever, but the result is yet profound, I would say, to start. And these folks are pretty well known for what they kind of did with this band afterwards, as well as other groups, and we'll find that they sort of follow a similar path, having come from a death metal band and become a notable black metal band in the kind of the underground spaces. So while I'd always appreciated melodic black metal because of a lot of different bands, it really was Thy Mighty Contract that sort of had me recognizing that there was some substance to black metal beyond the show of it, the aggression of it, and the frantic blasphemic nature of it. I think that Rotting Christ showed me that there was many different forms of black metal, and that it was more than just one style, that there was more than just the Norwegian or Swedish variants of it, which I do enjoy quite a bit. But this is one of the records of just a few that really pulled me into the Hellenic black metal sound and made it my preference overall. So my taste really centers around the introduction of Rotting Christ into the vernacular, as well as Varathron and some other groups. But this was the record where it was like, I just love everything about it. I like the, even if the drums are played on an electric kit and are a bit stiff, everything that adds to the unique character of this record and its advanced melodic ideas as the guitar sound and style of Sakastalis evolved is charming to me. It's beyond, it's one of my favorite records to just put on and enjoy. I can't count how many times I've picked up a guitar while listening to this record. I think it's just a cool thing, and it just always felt like there was something more to it. Beyond that point, I don't have that much to say. I think there are a couple of books written about Rotting Christ that effectively go over every bit of trivia, and I think that their history has been so well discussed and all that all that I could offer is my own personal experience with this being the record that sold the idea of melody in black metal to me. And of course, like Dissection and all of that did come later on, but this was the record that caught my attention, got me to buy it, all that stuff as a kid. And so there's a special place for me with Rotting Christ, and you'll see that as I would say the next 2 or 3 records from the band will be important for our discussion. So the only reason I'm mentioning Estuary of Calamity's demo here is to introduce a little bit of the kind of thing that we were getting in the Midwest Underground at the time. Introduce records that or tapes that maybe you might have read about in Wild Rags or something like that at the time, but also what the idea of black metal was and how it was fusing with different things by vague impressions. This was, I believe, an early band from Ash Thompson, who's known for a lot of other groups, but Estuary of Calamity would eventually become a maybe more of a symphonic black metal band later on. This was somewhere in their movement between being a brutal kind of death grind band to something that was more influenced by the Peaceful Three. There was an extreme doom metal, but also a brutal death metal touch to this group with some extended dungeon synth sounding. I guess we could compare it to early Thorns of the Carrion and things like that. In some aspect, it's a pretty rough demo. It's a very long demo, and I don't think that it's important to make that distinction. The only thing is that this is labeled as melodic black death metal, and technically there's some truth to that, but it's more that this is just a curio. It's a thing that introduces the band and how they would change over time, and also gets us talking about United States music just a little bit more, because there were bands that were influenced by what was going on in Europe at the time. It's just that we don't hear about them or have them mentioned as often because they were probably known for different styles at this point. So, of course, as when we talk about the Somber Lane, at the peak of 1993 in December, on this heralded label No Fashion, who kind of famously fell apart due to poor business practices and kind of selling out a bit. However you make that distinction, I wasn't there. Dissection is not necessarily the peak of our conversation, but probably the best recognized band among these groups, besides Rotting Christ these days, because they are a big part of the Swedish melodic death metal introduction, as well as they are the progenitors of the melodic black death metal sound. And of course, if you look at what At the Gates were doing at the time, this is nothing like that. If you look at what a lot of their contemporaries are doing, there were certain bands that were doing something like this, and they're still in their demo stages, and we could accuse Unanimated of having similar influences, and they were on the same label, of course. They were related in some way in terms of the taste of the label, but this is something above and beyond. This is one of the more impressive showings of the year. It is one of the best records of 1993 in terms of black metal related releases. Of course, death metal had its own interest in 1993 as well. The important note to make here is maybe to look back at the Sentenced record, the quite sophisticated technical death metal and melodic death and black metal touch, and then find the superior distinction of the melodic style of the guitar work and orchestra, the arrangements of Dissection's work on the Somber Lane, and still relate them to classic Swedish death metal and the more aggressive force of that style, as it took notes from Florida death metal earlier in the 90s and late 80s. So we still find that there's this attack abounding on this record, but there's also a certain beauty to all of it. There's this really consonant, complete melodic thoughts that carry through entire songs. These beautiful arcs of dual guitar melody developed that are very much above and beyond a lot of the stuff that was going on, even though I think that if a band like Dark Tranquillity had cinched up their ideas and maybe had a producer that was helping them arrange things, they might have arrived at a similarly effective route. So this is just a very classic record. It probably captivated a lot more death metal fans at the time, and eventually became more related to black metal as the band reached for their 1995 record, which was, I think most people feel like that was much more of a black metal record in every aspect, and a direct continuation of this sound and style. And I think the important thing to say about this record is that it very much is a gateway to this conversation, and the kind of record that really will sell people on this idea of melodic death metal, of course, but melodic black death metal as well. And the fact that they blur that line so well on this record is part of why it's so interesting to explore subgenre and the way that people perceive it. You could go ahead and say that this is a death metal record, but it's not that simple at all. And clearly, black metal was a big part of how it came together overall. So, yeah, again, just an important record to talk about, and we'll move on from dissection pretty quickly. They're very important early on, but we'll find that their influence is never ending in this subgenre. So, of course, they're important to continue talking about. So, as daunting as a two-part 1993 coverage of what was going on in general, I don't think that we've necessarily breached on melodic black death metal proper beyond a couple of these records, and I don't think that we've touched upon a pure melodic black metal result the way that I would see it form in 1994. And we'll get a couple of more clear examples with fewer resolute solutions to the question of what melodic black metal is just yet. It wasn't necessarily set in stone, but we will hear from more black metal bands and ones that stuck around and continued to be black metal for many years beyond that point. And so while this was a melodic death metal heavy sort of section of this exploration, we'll get more to the melodic black death metal bands here on out, and find some interesting distinctions to make along the way as we discover bands like Gates of Ishtar and everything in between. So for now, I would say there's a lot more to cover in 1994. It is really when black metal exploded, and we'll want to consider far more bands. So there'll be probably at least 3 parts to 1994, and those will take some time to sort of work through and chronologically order, so that, well, I'll take an extra week to sort of get everything more prepared and listen in depth and figure if there's anything new to say about that. So we'll get there when we get there.